want to talk about what the Green New Deal is going to cost and why it needs to be an eco-socialist program or it's not going to get done, and compare what I'm going to present here to what we've been getting. The Green New Deal has been the Green Party's signature program since 2008. It was the Green Party of England and Wales that first came out with it as a response to the Great Recession, big investment in clean energy, and social supports as a counter to the austerity programs of the center-left and center-right parties. And then the European Greens ran on that for European Parliament in 2009. And then Gloria Matera and I started running on that. She was a lieutenant governor running mate in New York. And we had a whole slate, Senate. So we had some federal demands in there. And it became so popular that by August, 62 Green candidates in the United States, we signed off on a Green New Deal. David Schwartzman was one of them down. I see David right there. Richard Whitney was one of them. So we started, that was 2010. And we've been agitating. Jill Stein ran on it for president. And then, the week after the election last year, the Sunrise Movement, with AOC accompanying them, sat in Pelosi's office. Media loved it, went viral. By the next month, there was a poll, 80% of the people are for it, including 64% of Republicans. The Green Party's out of the picture, and they took the brand and diluted the content. So, leading edge demand is a ban on fracking and all fossil fuel infrastructure, only fossil fuel infrastructure. That's not what AOC brought to Congress, whether it was a select committee or the non-binding resolution, because Pelosi killed the select committee. So they say, well, let's get a non-binding resolution. Nothing about military spending cuts. That statement we did in 2010, 62 of us called for 70% military spending cuts, because we got to put that money into this energy transition. They said nothing, or the timeline. We've been talking 2030. In fact, in 2010, we were saying 2020, because that's what the climate or the carbon budget said we had to do. Now, because we're 10 years later, we got to do 2030. It's going to take some time to build this out, and we're going to have to draw more carbon out of the atmosphere. With natural methods, and read David's book with his son, The Earth is Not for Sale, we're going to have to accelerate we're going to have to do carbon mineralization. We're going to have to take carbon out of the air and put it into the Earth's crust. And if we get time, we can talk a little bit about that, because we're behind schedule. And so that's kind of how we got here. And then the Democrats in Congress, Pelosi won't let them vote on a non-binding resolution. She just won't let them vote on it. And then the Senate, McConnell said, oh, you can vote on it. Half of you Democrats are running for president. Let's get you on the record. And the Democrats, Markey and Schumer, saying, oh, this is a trick. They won't let us bring expert witnesses. But really, they're going to make them go on the record. So Schumer told them, just vote president. And the good little Democrats did, except 4 of them voted with the Republicans against it. So if you think you're getting a Green New Deal from the Democrats, forget about it. You know, Medicare for all, forget about it. That's the real Democratic Party. AOC, Sanders and them, make them look better than they are. So now, despite it being killed in Congress, it won't die. So every Democrat's got to run on a Green New Deal. What are they talking about? I can run through each candidate. I probably don't have time, but they're talking about, at most, $3 trillion over 10 years public spending. Bernie Sanders came out with 16.3. He doesn't show us their numbers, but this budget I'm going to talk about in a minute, we got $27 trillion for the energy transition, and then $1.4 trillion for the Economic Bill of Rights. So one thing I will say for what AOC did is she left the Economic Bill of Rights in there. Rights to jobs, income, housing, healthcare, education, and secure retirement. If we don't make that link and adjust transition, we're not going to build a coalition to carry through the energy transition. That's essential. Unfortunately, remember in the Democratic debate, they were asked directly, what about the job guarantee? Isn't that irrelevant to energy transition? And none of the Democrats defended the job guarantee. They went around about 4 rounds and then CNN moved on. But that's where they're at. Steyer just had a statement yesterday. You know, he's got his little token Green New Deal, and he said it doesn't have a job guarantee. That's beside the point. That's what Inslee said. That's what most of them say. Not Sanders. So we looked at his numbers. The difference between his numbers, which are order of magnitude greater, in other words, another decimal point, another 0. He's talking about $16.3 trillion over 10 years instead of 3 trillion, double digit instead of single digit. We get 27 trillion. We think the difference is he's talking about 2050 to get through all the sectors. We're talking about 2030. He gets electricity by 2030, but that's only 28% of the carbon footprint. You got manufacturing, agriculture, buildings, transportation. They got to be converted too, that other 72%. And so this budget is for a timeline of basically a decade. And what the features of it, and then I'll just run through a little bit of it, is we're doing this through the government. We're not messing around like all the Democrats except Sanders for the energy sector with incentives and regulations and mandates while the billionaire class keeps the power, and they'll fight us every inch of the way. We're talking about nationalizing the railroad system, having a public energy system, both the utilities and auto production. You know, the Koch brothers and Exxon are not going to reinvest their earnings in renewables. We got to take them over. We're going to sell some fossil fuels in the transition, use those earnings, put them into renewables. Like I was saying earlier in the question and answer, we got to do like we did in World War II, where the federal government took over a quarter or built a quarter of manufacturing and planned a transition through the Office of War Mobilization. Now we need an Office of Climate Mobilization to coordinate all the federal agencies and do it with the energy system, the railroad system from the light rails, the trolley systems we need to build in the cities, the intercity high-speed rail, and the freight rails to really reduce the amount of truck and automobile traffic. That's the last leg on the transportation, and it should be by electrified vehicles. And then we got to socialize the manufacturing sector, or really build a whole new manufacturing sector. We've been hollowed out in the manufacturing in this country, and we don't even have a machine tool industry, which you need to build the equipment for intermediate goods and consumer goods. So we're going to rebuild this thing up. They'll be publicly owned, but we can lease them to worker co-ops. I think railroads you want as a public administration, like you would with a healthcare system, but in these factories, we want a Green New Deal factory in every congressional district. Like the military puts one, military industrial complex, we're going to build a green industrial complex over the next decade. So the bottom lines, and then I don't know how I'm doing on time, I don't know if I can go through all these sectors, but this is a summary that is on, it's not, this page is not public. We're doing one on my page that should be up shortly, but if I can work this equipment, you get to the bottom line. So, all right, this is right here. Where's the arrow? Where am I? I got an arrow. There it is. Boy, this is, where did the arrow go? Oh, there it is. All right. Those are the number of jobs, rebuilding all sectors, not just electricity, will create in the 10 years. These are the manufacturing jobs. So you're talking about 30.5 million jobs. Bernie got 20 million, but he's on a slower timetable. And in our case, which he doesn't deal with, the manufacturing is 8.7 million, and this is the annual cost, 2.7 trillion. And then the Economic Bill of Rights, you get some more jobs. We put a $5 million job guarantee, because not everybody can do construction and manufacturing. They're not suited for it for various reasons. But there are all kinds of social services people can provide. So we got roughly 5 million. I don't have time to explain how we got that number. So everybody, you don't go to the unemployment office when you're out of work. You go to the employment office. Say, I want my job. And there are social services and also public works and local communities that local communities have planned. And anyway, so you get to the bottom line of the Economic Bill of Rights. And so it's another 7.5 million and another 300,000 in manufacturing. And you can, well, let me just get to the very bottom line. So total spending, it's a 4.2 trillion. The Economic Bill of Rights plus what we call the Green Economy Reconstruction Program. And I would submit that this is what the Greens should be running on. We brought the Green New Deal to public attention. It's our issue, and we should set the standard and say, like I just did in summary, none of the Democrats are serious. They're just playing, except Sanders. And, you know, good effort, but it's too slow given the carbon budget situation, like anybody heard Greta Thunberg at the UN lay out for the stupid politicians. You know, it's not that complicated. This young woman could do it. So how am I doing on time? You wanted me to go 15?
You got about 5.
Okay, good. Well, let me just talk a little bit. Okay, 4.2 trillion a year, man. Where are we going to find the money? That's what they always ask. So we have basically progressive tax reforms. And we haven't, you know, like the wealth tax here, we just took from Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders just came up with a strong one. We might just plug that in there. But we got 2.2 trillion. Look, the rich got, you know, between Amazon and just what they got in their pockets, 6 trillion that we know about in this country. They're not investing in productive assets. They're investing in stocks and bonds. They're rearranging the productive assets we got, and in the process further concentrating the ownership. We can put that money to much better use by taxing it and running through the public sector and building this green economy. And then that's about half of what we need. The next biggest thing is basically public sector. Now, how do I get rid of
Just hit escape.
Yeah, okay. So we're talking about, well, this is the wrong title. It should say public banks and green quantitative easing or greenbacks. So green quantitative easing, basically the federal government issues bonds, or the Treasury Department does, and the Fed can back that up once they're sold into the market. They can't buy it directly, you know, and then put those assets on the federal balance sheet. And support an expansion of monetary supply, but that's debt-linked money. We're gonna have to pay that back someday. We need to do that because it'll cost us more not to do it than to do it. Now, the Green Party, of course, has this greening the dollar program. It's like the old populist greenbacks. The Treasury Department would just issue them, spend them into the economy without incurring debt. We prefer that, but we'll borrow if we have to. Oh, there's Peter. Yeah, co-author Peter and David. So now that comes to about 1.3 trillion. That's how much we're going to have to either create the money or borrow. And then, of course, we got the military spending cuts. We got 75%, stop the war on drugs, abolish ICE. There's some money, like if we do a guaranteed income through the tax system, the earned income tax credit money will come back into the general ledger. And what we don't count, two things we don't count, which means this thing could pay for it over time. Ecological taxes like a carbon tax. We do have a land value tax in there, but and taxes on the extraction of resources, which we really undertax in this country. That can generate some revenue and create the right incentives. And then the sale of public goods and services. Bernie points out, he thinks he can play for his plan by the sales of electricity because he's greatly expanding the public sector. We're talking about, we call it the interstate renewable electricity system. That's the electricity. We're going to sell manufacturing and agricultural machinery for zero waste manufacturing and regenerative agriculture. We're going to have all this transit, so we have fees for the high-speed rail system between cities and the transit within the cities, including freight. We have a big public housing program done the right way. There's rents from that. We retrofit buildings, put up solar panels. We can get some income there. And then part of our good public education for everybody is ending the digital divide, having a public internet, high-speed internet system, and you know, people pay some fees for that. So there's a lot of revenue we bring in. So finding the money is not a problem. The technology exists. The problem is labor. Where are we going to find 30 million people to do all this work, or 38 million? That is the bottleneck. And going back to the first studies that Ross Gelbsman, he got some oil executives and some people at Harvard and MIT back in the late 90s to say, well, how are we going to do this transition? And they came up with a study and they said, you know, we got the technology, we got the money, we don't have enough people to do the work fast enough to get to where we need to get to save ourselves from a climate disaster. So I think, let me just say, so there are two places you can look at this. This is a summary, which is easier to read because it's like a line item budget. And then, of course, people in my campaign wanted to get fancy. So they did it a little differently, and we're going to put the summary in. So, you know, you can sort of see it's got all the elements here. And when you scroll down, you can, you know, like, okay, overview, interstate electricity system. You got an explanation of how we got our numbers. And then you got to go down here to close that up. So you graphic people can decide whether that's the easier way to look at it. But anyway, the information's there. It just went live. And it's, if you go to, you know, my website, howiehawkins.us, look under Vision and the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal budget, you can read about the details. And then, you know, we want comments. Like, you might tell us, plug in Sanders' wealth tax instead of Warren's, generate more income, and get rid of more billionaires. You know, we probably take your advice on that. We want to start a discussion and get ourselves really familiar with these issues. So I'm going to stop there. I know Anita wants to talk about how the Green New Deal relates to the old Green New Deal and environmental justice. So that's part of the discussion, and that's why, you know, one thing I'll say for AOC is she kept the Economic Bill of Rights in there. Of course, Congress and the Democrats ain't doing anything with it, so that's why we need the Green Party. So thanks.
Couple of questions I've had about the Green New Deal since 2016, and Jill, and I actually talked to her about some of this stuff. Because some of the communities that I come out of, is the food sovereignty community, the indigenous community. I assume many people here have heard of the Red Deal, which is the indigenous-led sort of Green New Deal program. So, you know, there's a couple of things that, you know, like as Green, I want to be able to respond to in terms of like land management and disaster risk mitigation, which is important, especially in my region. Food sovereignty, I see that there's regenerative agriculture funds in here, but things that are sort of community-led, and of course the issue of sovereignty, and especially for indigenous people. So, you know, one of the things that the questions I've had is because a lot of these groups are now trying to get together and lobby the Democrats for the Green New Deal. You know, what are some channels to which A, as Greens, we can respond to some of their concerns, and B, you know, like have channels so that these same groups can also interface with us in terms of our Green New Deal.
Sure. Well,
You go first.
Okay.
Yeah, we need a lot of stuff on the Green New Deal. This is just a budget. It doesn't cover a lot of stuff. There's an introduction to it. It says we don't cover some stuff. One of the things we don't cover is land rights in the treaties with Indians, as well as the Treaty of Hidalgo Guadalupe for Mexicans that have lost their land, and particularly New Mexico. That has to be respected. And I find that movements with the most energy are the people fighting for their land, whether they're indigenous people or people in upstate New York fighting pipelines and gas-fired power plants. I was fortunate enough to be invited up to speak to it's called a paddle-up flotilla in northern Michigan, Labor Day weekend. And I told them when they wanted me to come up there and speak, I told them, you know, being a Teamster, I could have spoken at any number of Labor Day events, but I thought this was the most important because they're talking about creating more jobs. They were talking about a Green New Deal as part of their effort to shut down Enbridge Line 5. Enbridge has this line of pipeline that's bringing oil from the fracked Bakken oil fields in North Dakota and the Alberta tar sands. It's, you know, that oil should stay in the ground. And they organized a great thing. Now, the woman that invited me, I met her at the outside of Democratic debate. There was a Detroit demonstration, Make Detroit the Engine of the Green New Deal, which it speaks to the manufacturing piece I've been talking about. So I got introduced by one Green to this Indian woman who had organized a caucus of Indians in the Democratic Party. And she said, you gotta come and speak at this thing, because we don't trust the Democrats. You know, we need you to put pressure, help us put pressure. So I think that's really important. And that was, she was a leader in the Little Traverse Bay band of Dawa Indians, but there are a dozen or so indigenous nations federally recognized up there, and they are the ones defending Huron and Erie. Marky, what's her name, Marky Miller?
Yes.
Yeah, she was presenting at that thing. I got to meet her there. So I think this is key. And as far as the agriculture goes, another thing that we need to talk about is how we put working farmers securely on the land and get the corporate farms out. Because they're the ones pushing the disastrous land management, the chemicalization and pesticides that's killing the insects. You know, aside from global warming, the insects are dying off. And that'll collapse ecosystems, which will collapse agriculture, which will collapse our civilization. So there are a lot of things we gotta do here. We gotta do, one thing the the old New Deal did, was they had a very strong agricultural program. We need to have parity pricing and supply management for small farmers, and include not just the big commodities, but fruits and vegetables and dairy. And then basically get corporate farms out and get people that want to go back on the land. You know who wants to go back on the land is these immigrants from Mexico and Guatemala. They run the dairy industry now. I can tell you about New York and the vegetable farms. They're picking the crops, and the kids, so the white farmers don't want to go farm. The Mexicans do, and the Guatemalans do. They're the future farmers. We got to have a program to get them on the land and get the corporations off the land. So those are some reactions to some of the issues you raised. And man, this is such a big topic. We gotta keep talking about it. And also, one more thing I want to say. And we cannot allow the Green New Deal to be administered by governors and mayors when they're oppressed communities that get fronted off with all the money that comes through the feds now. I mean, this goes back to the Black Panther Party saying we need community control of the police and proposing in Berkeley, university community, black community, and the white folks up on the hill. And they had different needs, and that was so the black community could have, juries of peers and police responsive to them. And you can do the same thing with the anti-poverty program in the 60s. My city of Syracuse had a really strong program being organized by Wiley, my wife's father, George Wiley. He was in Secor and then started what eventually became Acorn, and he died in a boating accident. He got run out of the city, but and then Daley in Chicago and Walsh in Syracuse told Johnson, you can't do this maximum feasible participation. They're organizing against me. So they just said, we'll run it through the governors and the mayors, and then the poor communities got left out. And it became, salaries for middle class people instead of benefits for the people that the program was supposed to help. That's why we gotta have community control of these programs. So, it's a big discussion.
I have a comment and a question. One, I want to say, thank you for putting this into numbers and really detailed numbers. I think this is something that we need as an eco-socialist group and as a party to have something like this broken down so that candidates can move forward with it and organizations can do it. So thank you for that. It's amazing how far it's come in 9 years. My question for you, I guess, is in terms of how you're going to pay for it. I saw there was a section on kind of fees for public services, and I'm just curious how you have kind of decided on that, because it seems to me some of them might be something we might want to either decommodify or provide for free, like a high-speed rail to get people out of cars. And I don't know if you just mean a modest fee or if you mean something more like Amtrak prices now. But if you want to get people into high-speed rail, it seems like we want to make it as cheap as possible. Same thing with housing. We may want to attack gentrified markets and essentially the housing sector with free public housing that we can provide. So I guess I'm just curious, because you don't have numbers and you didn't have time really to talk about it, but just kind of what the thinking was there.
Well, the thinking is, oh, please, yeah.
The thinking is right up there. And, we wrote, we have not calculated revenues from the sales of goods, public goods and services from public sector industries, such as electric sales, public transportation fares, public housing, and green machinery sales. These revenues will reduce the net cost and could fully pay for the green economy reconstruction program over time. And this is the key answer. What those prices should be are policy decisions which will have to balance the need for revenues and the need to provide some goods and services at lower costs, like clean electricity and public transportation, to encourage their use. So what this is saying, we should have a planning process that figures these things through. And the one thing I'll add to the planning process, that needs to have community control. It should be a federated system where citizen assemblies at the grassroots is where the big questions get debated, and then it's brought up to higher levels. And so those communities can speak for their particular needs and also what they want for the big decisions that everybody's got to be part of. It just can't be a central bureaucracy and one big planning commission in the center of the country. It has to be a participatory process, or some people will be excluded given historical disparities based on class, race, and so forth.
Okay. I've got next people here. I put myself in the stack earlier. You missed some of the opening sessions this morning, Howie, but question here is, there, at least on the surface of things, is there might be a tension between the Green New Deal that envisions a rather large expansion of state control of industry versus some of the language in our platform in eco-socialism, which says that we want to avoid state-controlled socialism, right? We want something that's more participatory. We want something that represents direct workers' control of industry to some extent. I think there's ways of resolving that tension, but I was wondering what your take on that would be. How would you resolve that tension, and how would you reconcile the Green New Deal as presented here with that other vision of eco-socialism?
Well, I think it's an old conflict in the socialist movement between centralized state control and a federalist administration. So you're coordinating from the bottom up. And Marx was not clear on that. I mean, him and Engels, like you read, what was that essay by Engels? Forgetting the name. But, he basically says, we're going to take over the state. It's almost authoritarian. And then when they talk about the Paris Commune, them and the anarchists agree that's the proletarian state, or the new. It's not the old state, it's a new state where the people have real power. So I think we got to think about federalism, like I was just describing on planning and administration. And I was earlier saying, like I think a railroad system should be a publicly administered enterprise with, measures of workers' control. So, the brakemen and the engineers and the so forth on the line, and the people that work on the tracks, they have some control over their own labor process within that public administration. The Green New Deal factories, I don't see a reason to need to administer that centrally. You build them out, and when they're producing for their markets, lease out the publicly owned equipment to worker cooperatives, and the workers will control their labor process and whatever surplus value they get when their products are sold. So I think within that framework, I think you resolve that contradiction. What I don't want to see us do is kind of push a syndicalist or just only workers co-op thing where you get this competition in the market and you're reproducing some of the problems of capitalism and you're not coordinating. We got to coordinate. The question is it bottom up or top down?
Yeah, in your section about stopping some programs to generate some revenue, I couldn't help but notice you had an item there, funds redirected from safety net. Can you talk about that? I mean, you probably need to explain that really well, because that kind of looks like, you're taking,
Right.
you're affecting the safety net.
Yeah, well, that's because people won't need those programs because they're above the poverty line. That's where that money is calculated from. So it's like the earned income tax credit. We provide a guaranteed income above poverty through the income tax. So if you're below poverty, you get a check every month instead of paying taxes. And then the qualification for food stamp are basically the poverty line is your net, and your gross has to be 125% of poverty line. A lot of people through these jobs and other programs provided for the Economic Bill of Rights won't be qualified for food stamps anymore. So there'll be savings there. Unemployment compensation. You provide a job guarantee, you don't have to pay people not to work while they're looking for work, because they gotta work. So that's where those numbers come from.
Just in terms of context and growing sort of the green manufacturing system, we're poised on this new fourth industrial revolution. So the folks in Davos are looking at a new manufacturing construct that is largely laborless. And so it's going to run on the Internet of Things and 5G. And a lot of the UN Sustainability Development Goals are very much tied with ICT, technology that relies on increased use of water and energy and rare minerals. And I'm just curious if the Green Party, like eco-socialists, has a position on this level of manufacturing. Are we buying into sort of automated autonomous vehicles on smart highways, for efficiency, or, I mean, I see that the red deal is in contrast to that in its right relations with the land and one another, and that's very much oppositional to this 5G route. And I'm just looking for a little clarity on what the position is.
The technology we're talking about with this new manufacturing technology, first of all, it mitigates the problem of rare earth or any other kind of mining, because we're talking about zero waste, recycling, reuse, ending planned obsolescence. So we're having a lot less material throughput. We're talking about an economy that is based more on use value than exchange value, so that we're providing things free through the public sector, and we're providing goods that last longer, so there's longer wealth or use value and less exchange value. So the GDP may shrink, the amount of material going through the economy may shrink, and our quality of life will increase.
Okay,
Is-
5G specifically.
I was just getting to 5G.
All right.
My position is we should use the precautionary principle. We do know that, radio frequency has biological effect. How adverse that is under scientific dispute. So we don't go ahead until we know. There is a problem. Now, in building this thing out, there's a lot of labor and work, construction work, manufacturing work, the kind we call blue collar, that you're right, as we get more automated, is going away. The question is, after we build this out in a decade, then you got the problem of what's the zero marginal cost or lower marginal cost. In other words, once you build a solar panel, you don't have to buy fuel all the time. The sun is that nuclear power plant that's providing the solar radiation that we just harvest. The wind, the winds blow, the sun shines, the rivers flow, and we just got to capture that. We build the infrastructure to capture it, then there's a lot less investment, a lot less work. We just got to maintain that system and reproduce it, not build it out from scratch. Then we face the problem of high productivity, less need for labor time. And if we handle it right, we'll all have more free time. We'll be freer. We got to have, as the Greens put in their first economic program in Germany, without saying how they do it, we need a fair distribution of work and income. The idea to give a basic grant to people so who can't work anymore, it's just putting them on the dole. They aren't part of productive society. They aren't doing the creation that work does. Everybody should have access to productive work and an income, that gives them a decent life. And without going into how we might do that, I think that should be our goal.
I'm glad you mentioned the fact that we're pro-nuclear power, but it's 93 million miles away. It's a fusion reactor of the sun, not fission power on the surface of the earth.
See what you did there?
Now, the issue, I happen to join the eco-socialist group in Democratic Social America. I wanted to be among millennials, so after the 2016 election, I joined it. And it's more radical than DSA was in the past, I have to say. And we have been addressing, we have an eco-socialist working group. I think there's a lot of commonality with what we've been discussing here. One of the issues is, you mentioned regenerative agriculture. We've been discussing that too, and I think it's maybe not the best terminology to use, because regenerative agriculture in in the general description has included large-scale cattle raising, which some claim is ecological, but they neglect the methane emissions and so on. It's a point of discussion. I'm saying very large scale, and of course factory farming. And also, I think agroecology is a better term, and it's a worldwide movement. And in agroecology, transforming industrial agriculture and GMO agriculture to an ecological mode also will, as you mentioned in the beginning, will be a form of negative carbon emissions, which we have to have. But in itself, it's not sufficient, because even with modest warming, CO2 will come out of the soil and go in the atmosphere. It's the capacity to store is diminished. So as you mentioned, we're going to, we argued in our book that we need very large-scale sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the crust, like basalt, rock, and there are pilot projects underway, like in Iceland. And in solar, the key in this, I'll finish my remark, the key in this is the solarization of the energy system, because that will allow this to take place and also phase out extractivism. As you mentioned, recycling can be greatly facilitated once we have a solar infrastructure. Okay, that's just a few comments, thank you.
Any response?
Yeah, I think where you can, relate to the DSA people. That's like, these are new young socialists for the most part, learning. But it varies from place to place. I mean, I'll tell you in New York, I ran for governor. The Syracuse chapter didn't even respond to our request for an interview for endorsement. The New York City chapter, which is huge, instead of debating whether they should endorse us, debated whether they should talk about whether to endorse us. And that was a bureaucratic move. It was a close vote, but, there's those kind of games. Gloria is right down there in Brooklyn where they are. They know who I am. I've run for governor 3 times. Not once has anybody in DSA invited us to talk about the Green New Deal. There's a sectarianism here from DSA, the whole nonprofit industrial complex, and the progressive Democrats. They want to act like we don't exist. And so we should talk, but we should also insist that we should be part of the broader discussion. Because if we're going to win this demand, we got to have a broad front. And I think it's the Greens going to have to teach them how to do a united front where everybody gets to speak. We may disagree tactically on our relationship to the Democratic Party, but we're all for some kind of Green New Deal, the DSA, Eco-Socialist Green New Deal, basically on the right track. We should be fighting shoulder to shoulder. Instead, they're keeping us away because we're not on their tactic to take over the Democratic Party, which isn't going to happen. So I say critically engage DSA and groups like it, 350.org, the Sunrise Movement, and so forth.
One of my concerns with Green New Deal is it's kind of, I think to a lot of people it's kind of techno-utopian. I think a lot of people get the impression that we can just keep on doing what we do nowadays and same amount of energy consumption, and we'll just do it with solar and wind. And my wife works in the power industry, and state laws require utility companies to provide all the energy that people demand. So there seems to be a real big emphasis on what they call the supply side, the wind and the solar. But in the power business, they talk about the demand side too. They've got to meet the demand. And the sooner we can change the demand for power, the sooner we'll achieve all these things, because we won't have to build out as much. But so how do you deal? I know there's some things in the Green New Deal that deal with the demand side, but I think there needs to be more emphasis on it. What do you guys think?
We're not going to shop our way out of this crisis. We got to deal at the point of production. That means we got to transform the way we produce, and then from there, how we consume. That's where we're going to get the efficiency. If you've been involved, and if your wife's working in the industry, the utilities resist efficiency because they make more money when we're inefficient, because we got to pay higher, fees. So that's where I think it starts. And as I talked about earlier, we can have a system that provides more use value, in other words, wealth and quality of life, with less material throughput and less exchange value, in other words, sales on the market. So the GDP goes down, but our wealth goes up. But there's another thing. If we're going to bring the rest of the world up to a decent standard of living, we're going to have to produce more energy. And again, I'd recommend the Schwartzman's book. read what they talk about. They talk about a minimum electric power standard. If we're going to transform manufacturing, agriculture, if we're going to power everything by electricity, we're going to need more electric power production. I think that's just in the nature of things. So I don't know if it's techno-optimist or not, it's just techno-realist, is the way I look at it. And I was going to make one other point. There was the Paley Commission. We were worried about losing oil after World War II. You know, where are we going to get it from? We got to fight in the Middle East for it. So Truman formed the Paley Commission to make recommendations of where the United States should go in its energy future. Paley Commission recommended in 1954 we go solar. But Eisenhower said, no, we're going nuclear for military reasons and because of, you know, Westinghouse and them thought this is going to be a big moneymaker for them. Now, that was not a market decision, and that was not a democratic decision. That was an elite bureaucratic state manager's decision, military and elected officials. So that means we got to democratize how we make these decisions, because I think the people will make better decisions because we're not going to screw ourselves, you know. If we own our own jobs and work with co-ops, we're not going to move to China to pay ourselves less.